the more than two-thirds of Australians who live in owner-occupied homes would not thank us for putting in policies that undermine the values of their own homes. They would not welcome that. They would not consider that good policy, and neither does the Turnbull government.
Hi, my name is Jan Wisniewski and this is The Strive, a podcast to discuss issues in Australia with the long term in mind. In Australia, homes are expensive. Whether it's an apartment or a house, our income is not keeping up with the asking price. Accordingly, home ownership rates are falling. When I was born in 1991, 68.6% of people had bought the home they were living in. That number had fallen to 65.5% by 2016, the sharpest drop-off coming from people aged in their mid-20s to mid-50s. As with many issues leading us to an undesirable future, short-term political risks come into play as a possible reason for the lack of effective action. As we heard at the top of the episode, Australian Treasurer Scott Morrison is wary of upsetting Aussies that own their homes and who wouldn't mind seeing prices keep creeping up. But if we do want to bring housing prices in line with what Australians can afford and stop those home ownership rates from falling further, then there are plenty of changes to be made. In this episode, you'll hear independent economist Saul Eslake and his opinions on the policies that have led to the decline in home ownership and what can be done to improve housing affordability in Australia. Thank you very much for joining me today.
That's a pleasure.
Last year, you were quoted in a Saturday paper piece that was written by Mike Seacombe about housing prices in Australia. In the piece, you explained over a 14-year period between the censuses of 1947 and 1961, the Australian home ownership rate rose from about 53 to about 70%. You then added that was despite the fact Australia's population was growing at an unprecedented pace as a result of the post-war migration boom and baby boom. According to the 2016 census, the home ownership rate was at 65.5%, the lowest rate since 1954. Given we seem to have had that golden age of housing ownership, shouldn't we be looking to that time period for cues for our policy direction now? Or is our post-global financial crisis world too different to those post-war economic boom years?
I think the current world is very different from the period immediately after the end of the Second World War. In particular, our cities are very different. They're much bigger and more spread out, and the cost of providing public transport, roads, and other infrastructure to our geographically very large cities by international standards is such that we need to be careful about the lessons we draw from comparisons with the decades immediately after the end of the Second World War. But there is one very important point that I think can be drawn from a comparison with that earlier experience that's relevant in the context of today's housing policy debate, where there's a minority but growing number of people who blame high rates of immigration for our decline in housing affordability and home ownership, and where some people call explicitly for the immigration intake to be significantly reduced in order to alleviate home ownership pressures and housing stress. And the lesson that comes from that earlier post-war period is that Australia's population grew much more rapidly during that era than it has done over the past 2 decades. Between the 1947 and 1961 censuses, Australia's population grew at an average annual rate of 2.4%. That's almost a percentage point per annum above the rate of growth of Australia's population between the 2001 and 2016 censuses, that is, over the last 15 years. But what's striking is during that period between 47 and 61, that, as you say, the home ownership rate rose by some 17 percentage points. And if you look at, as best we can, data on house prices, they actually fell slightly as a proportion of incomes. That is, it took fewer years to purchase an average price house in the early 1960s than it did in the late 1940s. And the reason for that is that the rate of growth of the housing stock outpaced the rate of growth of the population during that 15 or so years after the end of the Second World War. The dwelling stock increased at an average annual rate of 2.8%, that is almost half a percentage point per annum faster than the growth rate of the population. Whereas in the last 15 years, the housing stock has risen at about the same rate as the population. Moreover, the average number of people per dwelling has fallen from around 3 3/4 in the 1950s and early 60s to about 2 3/4 today. So you actually need more dwellings to accommodate a given growth in the number of people than we did 30 years ago or more. So I think the key lesson to be drawn out of the 1950s and early 60s that's relevant to Australia is that in that earlier period, we were able to have rapid population growth, more rapid than we've had recently, without putting upward pressure on house prices and with increasing rates of home ownership. Because in those days, government policy was focused on increasing the supply of housing, whereas since, I'd argue, the mid-1960s, government policy has increasingly been focused on inflating the demand for housing at the federal level, while at the state and local level, government policy seems to have had the effect, intentionally or otherwise, of restricting growth in the supply of housing. And in any market, when you inflate demand and constrain supply, the almost inevitable result is higher prices, and that's what we've had.
Okay, then could you explain some of those policies that we still have in place now that were having that effect, on a federal level perhaps, to start with?
Well, but just to go back to that period, the 1950s and 60s, the primary focus of government housing policy was to increase the supply of housing. And governments did that principally by building a lot of houses themselves. The federal government provided substantial financial assistance to the state governments to build houses both for rent to people who would never be able to buy homes of their own, and for sale to people who couldn't qualify for the limited amount of private housing finance that was available in those eras, but nonetheless, with a certain amount of assistance, were able to purchase homes on more concessional lending terms. And that was, as I say, accompanied by a significant amount of new building. In the 1950s, the public sector was directly responsible for more than 1 in every 5 new dwellings that were constructed at that time. Now, of course, many of those houses were poorly built and they were poorly located, especially from the standpoint of access to employment and community services. But at least they gave people somewhere to live. Beginning in the mid-1960s with the first homeowners grant introduced by the Menzies government after the 1963 election, government policy at the federal level has increasingly shifted away from boosting the supply of housing towards providing would-be home purchasers with cash in an attempt to supposedly help them purchase housing, or providing tax breaks to investors who buy housing. And the result of those policies has been to inflate the demand for housing, whilst federal governments and state governments have backed away from building houses themselves. And state and local government planning authorities have, over the last 30 or 40 years, made it both more difficult and expensive and more time-consuming to either build new residential housing estates on the suburban fringe or to redevelop existing inner-city locations at higher densities for fear of offending the neighbours who already live in those cities. And so, again, as I say, over the last 40 or so years, Australian housing policy has shifted away from boosting supply towards inflating demand and restraining supply. And I think this is a big reason both for the substantial increase in Australian house prices over the last 30 or 40 years and for the decline in home ownership from a peak of 72.5% in 1966 to what at 2016, 65.5% is actually the lowest since the 1954 census. Australia is no longer one of the highest home owning countries in the world. According to OECD statistics, we're actually at the top of the bottom third of countries in the advanced world ranked by home ownership rates.
You mentioned there, I think it was the Home Savings Grant Scheme from the 1960s.
That's right, the one first introduced by the Menzies government after the 1963 election.
Yeah. Do you see parallels in the ideas behind that policy with something that was introduced by the Howard government in the early 2000s, the First Homeowner Scheme, and also a policy introduced by the Andrews government in Victoria just last year, aiming to help young people get into the housing market by reducing the stamp duty they pay on property purchases? Do those policies have similar goals, and would you criticise them equally?
Yes, they do have similar goals. They're based on the belief that if you give would-be first home buyers cash, either as a direct grant or by permitting them to pay less tax when they purchase a dwelling than they otherwise would, that you will thereby increase the home ownership rate by making it easier for people to purchase first homes. The first homeowner grant introduced by the Howard government in 2000 was a direct echo of the scheme first introduced by the Menzies government in the early 1960s and then replicated in various forms by subsequent governments, the Fraser government and the Hawke government. Ironically, the Menzies government scheme was introduced at the urging of the New South Wales Young Liberals at a time when John Howard was actually the state president of the New South Wales Young Liberals. The difference between that scheme and the ones administered by the Fraser and Hawke governments and the one introduced by the Howard government in 2000 is that the 1960s, 70s and 80s schemes only applied to people who purchased new dwellings. In other words, there was at least an attempt to use these schemes to bolster the supply of new housing, whereas the first homeowner grant, which the Howard government introduced in 2000, applied to first home buyers purchasing existing housing, not just those purchasing new housing, even though it was styled as compensation for the fact that the GST, which commenced at the same time, would be applicable to new housing. There was never any GST on purchases of established housing, yet first home buyers of established housing got a $7,000 grant as well. And on some occasions in subsequent years, that grant was significantly increased for temporary periods. I think all this history tells us that any policy which enables Australians to pay more for housing than they otherwise would, whether it's through cash grants, stamp duty concessions, or for that matter, lower interest rates, any policy that allows Australians to pay more than they otherwise would for housing results in more expensive housing, not in more widespread home ownership. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the home ownership rate in Australia has been declining since federal government policy flipped over in the mid-1960s from boosting supply towards inflating demand. And the stamp duty concessions and other first homeowner grant schemes that have been introduced by state governments in both New South Wales and Victoria in the current financial year, and for that matter, the home savings grant through superannuation scheme introduced in the federal budget last year, all of these are subject to the same flaw, that by giving would-be first home buyers access to greater cash so that they can spend more on housing than they otherwise would, all you really do is reshuffle the queue of would-be first homeowners. Those who are able to take advantage of the grant will move to the head of the queue, probably pay more for the homes they buy than they otherwise would, and the money ends up in the pockets of those who sell the homes. I've often said that these schemes should actually be called second home vendors grants rather than first home buyers grants, because that's where the money ends up.
Okay, well, on the face of it, these schemes are in place to get people into the housing market. And we've seen home ownership rates drop generally, as we've been talking about, but particularly amongst younger people. What would you propose instead in terms of policy to allow people to get into the market?
In simple terms, and we can go into this in more detail, I would say abandon policies that have the effect of inflating the demand for housing and shift to policies that have the effect of boosting the supply of housing. More specifically, I would say stop giving inducements to people to buy more housing or spend more on housing than they otherwise would, such as tax breaks for investors in housing, negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount. Stop giving first homeowner grants and other types of cash support to people, which inevitably mean that they pay more for homes than they otherwise would, rather than that more people are enabled to buy homes. And on the supply side, reduce or remove bureaucratic and regulatory obstacles to the construction of more housing, both on the suburban fringe and higher density infill developments, make that easier to occur. Build more housing directly, probably not using public sector construction gangs, but working with not-for-profit organisations and the like to directly construct more new and especially affordable housing. And finally, remember that transport policy in cities has an important housing policy dimension as well. So by providing appropriate and adequate roads and public transport, areas where new housing can be built can be made more accessible and affordable for people who might contemplate living in those areas than is the case at the moment, where in many cases to get access to housing that people can afford to buy, they have to compromise on the amount of time that they spend commuting from and to places of employment.
So from what you're saying there are a number of different policies that need to be put in place or replaced rather than some kind of golden policy that is going to fix housing affordability in Australia. But I'd like to turn to something that has had our politicians rushing to contradict each other recently, and that's negative gearing, which you did mention in your previous answer. In your opinion, what would happen if we were to cut back negative gearing?
In my view, curtailing negative gearing and or the capital gains tax discount, which needs to be brought in here because the change to the capital gains tax regime instituted by the Howard government in 1999 played an important role in enhancing the appeal of negative gearing to would-be property investors. So the two have to be taken together. In my view, curtailing negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount would reduce what has been over the last 15 or so years an increasingly important source of upward pressure on the price of housing. The proportion of Australian taxpayers who are negatively geared landlords has increased quite significantly since 1999. And the proportion of housing finance going to investors has risen from less than 20% in the early 1990s to as much as 50% in some recent years, reflecting the growing share of housing purchases that are being undertaken by investors. Now, what in effect is happening is that would-be home purchasers are facing increased competition from investors, the overwhelming majority of whom buy existing dwellings, not new housing, and that competition has forced up the price of housing to the detriment of would-be first home buyers, to the benefit of investors who get their interest bills subsidised by being able to write them off against their other income as negative gearing allows. So in my view, reducing that, curtailing negative gearing would mean less upward pressure on house prices, and I would say that's a good thing. It's less clear, in my view, that it would result in significant downward pressure on house prices as adherents of or supporters of negative gearing assert. They sometimes point to what allegedly happened in the mid-1980s when the Hawke government did temporarily, as it turned out, abolish negative gearing. They say, defenders of negative gearing, that this caused a massive withdrawal of landlords from the property market and rents went through the roof. if you actually go back and look at what happened then, rents did rise in Sydney and Perth, but in my view, not because of the abolition of negative gearing, but rather because just before negative gearing was abolished in 1985, the rental vacancy rate in those two cities had fallen to about 2%, historic lows. The rents would have risen in those two cities anyway, and it did. If the abolition of negative gearing had been the reason, rents should have risen everywhere, and they didn't. They didn't rise in the other major capital cities. So nonetheless, supporters of negative gearing continued to chant this mantra about what allegedly happened. If negative gearing were to be curtailed now, but as proposed by the opposition ahead of the last election, existing landlords were to be grandfathered, that is, they would keep their negative gearing entitlements and it would only be new investor entrants to the property market who couldn't get it, then in my view there'd be very little forced selling by investors of negatively geared properties, because if they did, they lose their tax privileges, so they'd be more likely to hang on. In other words, there'd be, I think, very little downward pressure on house prices. But if there was, let's suppose that landlords did move to sell investment properties if negative gearing were no longer available, you have to ask, who would they sell them to? They wouldn't sell them to other landlords for the same reason that existing landlords would be selling their properties. They would be selling them to previously frustrated would-be home buyers. And as a result, those people who are currently renting and then buy homes from landlords who are selling would no longer need to rent. The demand for rental housing would fall by the same amount as the supply of it, and there's absolutely no reason why rents should go up in any significant way. So I say that of the various things that a federal government could do to arrest and reverse the slide in home ownership rates, especially among young people over the last 30 or 40 years, reducing negative gearing and curtailing the capital gains tax discount would, I think, be the most effective thing and helpful thing that they could do.
Staying on the rental market, which you just touched upon then, if there are less people owning homes, then it follows that more people are renting. For people who've resigned themselves to maybe never taking the plunge and getting a mortgage, are they likely to live a happy life renting in Australia? What's the outlook for people renting?
Well, they will miss out on what has been an important source of increases in personal wealth for previous generations of Australians since the mid-1950s or early 1960s. Of course, as they always say, past performance is no guarantee of future returns, and I find it hard to believe that from present levels, Australian property prices could deliver over the next 25 years the same sort of returns to property owners that they've enjoyed over the last 25 years. So I suppose it could be that by not buying a house now, people are avoiding the risk that property prices might at some point fall during the next 25 years. But there are some other disadvantages associated with renting in the Australian system. In particular, the lack of security of tenure is a major problem faced by renters. There's survey evidence that shows that renters move much more often than people who own their own homes, and it isn't always by choice. It's because the landlord may want to sell the property, or the landlord may wish and be able to put up the rent by more than a tenant can afford to pay. And of course, by comparison with many other countries, there are more restrictions on the lifestyles of tenants as to whether they can own pets, for example, and whether they can make minor alterations to a property, such as hanging pictures. In some continental European countries like France, Germany, and Austria, leases are typically for much longer than is the case in countries like Australia, and tenants have more rights to make minor alterations and to keep pets and the like. So tenancy in Australia is a much less secure form of tenure than home ownership, and a less secure form of tenure than in some overseas countries with otherwise similar standards of living to Australia.
Okay, I just wanted to turn to a slightly different issue. We've got an ageing society, and as we've been talking about throughout this interview, levels of home ownership in Australia are in decline. Last year, you wrote a report that looked at what these two things meant, entitled No Place Like Home, the impact of declining home ownership on retirement. What were the main findings of the report? What do future retirees have to look forward to?
The report was informed by the widespread but largely unspoken assumption behind Australia's retirement income system that the overwhelming majority of retirees will have close to zero housing costs in retirement, because most retirees will own their homes outright and hence not have any mortgage to service, and their housing costs will simply be maintenance and council rates, utilities and the like, whilst for the very small minority of retirees who hadn't attained home ownership during their working lifetimes, they traditionally have been housed in public housing where rents are fixed at a relatively low proportion of their incomes. And this assumption of close to zero housing costs has enabled Australia to spend less on age pensions as a proportion of our income than many other countries. Means testing of our pensions helps contribute to that result as well. But the point of this report that I wrote last year was to show that this assumption that most retirees will have zero housing costs is becoming increasingly invalid and will become even more invalid as time goes on. That's because, first of all, as we've just been discussing, a growing proportion of the population will never attain home ownership and will be renting throughout their working lives and thus will need to rent throughout their retirement years as well. And secondly, because of those who do enter home ownership during their working lives, an increasing number still have mortgage debt outstanding when they reach 65 or whatever their retirement year is. And that means that they use their superannuation lump sums to pay off their mortgage, which is entirely rational. But then, of course, having done that, their superannuation savings aren't available to provide them with a retirement income, which is the intention of the superannuation system. And the third problem that I identified is the declining availability of public and social housing, so that an increasing proportion of retirees, pensioners and self-funded retirees who are renting from private landlords rather than public housing, and they're paying a much bigger proportion of their relatively low incomes in rent than pensioners who are renting from public housing authorities are. So we will face pressure for increasing the rate of pension, increasing the rate of rental assistance paid to pensioners who rent, or increasing amounts of poverty among retirees than we have come to accept as the norm over the post-war era.
So you just touched on it then, but I think maybe it's worth going into it a little bit further. How would you assess the state of the public housing sector in Australia?
Well, public housing represents a much smaller proportion of the housing stock than at any time since the 1950s now, and that reflects the fact that since the late 1980s, governments, federal and state, have largely withdrawn from the business of constructing new social housing, apart from a brief flurry in the aftermath of the financial crisis as a form of economic stimulus in response to the financial crisis. And moreover, the stock of public housing that was constructed in the 1950s, 60s and early 70s is becoming increasingly dilapidated and unfit for the purposes for which it is intended, having regard to the fact that the mix of people who live in public housing these days is very different from that of the 1950s and 60s, and their needs are often much more complex than they were back then. There has been some growth in the provision of affordable rental housing by community groups and not-for-profit companies, and some of those are working with state housing authorities to provide better management of the stock of public housing, or in various ways to increase the supply of social housing managed by not-for-profits and community groups. But again, this is very much at the margin of the overall housing system. And in my view, Australia really does need to address the deteriorating supply of affordable rental housing if we're not to face a range of other unwelcome social problems over the next 2 decades.
All right, I think that's a pretty good place to wrap things up. Do you have a take-home message for how we can improve housing affordability in Australia?
And I think the basic message I'd like to convey is the one where we started, that governments need to focus less on inflating the demand for housing and more on increasing the supply of housing. That is, by doing more to facilitate the construction of homes by the private sector, doing less that obstructs the construction of homes by the private sector, but also putting more public resources into the construction of affordable rental housing for those who can never purchase housing through the private sector, to recognise the important linkages between urban transport policy and housing policy, and to reduce the incentives that Australia's taxation system provides to people who simply want to speculate on the price of existing housing rising year after year.
Thanks very much for your time, Saul.
That's a pleasure, Jan. Good to talk with you.
That was Saul Eslake with his thoughts on Australia's housing affordability problem. And this has been The Strife. If you like what you hear, find us on SoundCloud, subscribe via iTunes, and why not follow us on Twitter as well. I'll leave you today with the start of a track called Efforts from Body Corporate. It appears on the Plastic World compilation from 2016, a showcase of some excellent Australian electronic music. Have a listen, and I'll catch you later.